whispering something like a prayer in only a way a 5-year-old could do, saying, God, get me out of here. And then God revealed himself in the form, he descended upon those sky tubes in the form of a 10-year-old snotty-nosed boy who tapped me on the shoulder and led me to my promised land and delivered me out of the sky tubes. Now, I tell you this story just because it stands out to me. You probably have your own story that's probably a lot more severe than that. We've all had moments where we've whispered the prayer, God, get me through this. Deliver me. And that's what we're looking at today, asking the question, hey, what does it look like practically to see this happen? And so we're going to see that in the Israelite story, climactically bringing the Exodus story to a close. Look with me in Exodus chapter 14, and we'll read through this account together. It says this, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. You must camp in front of Baal-zephon, facing it by the sea. And so these verses are going to lead us into the first thing that we need to recognize together when it comes to trusting God for deliverance. Here's the first thing you need to know and keep in mind. It's this, that God desires to show up in desperate circumstances. Like, you need to trust this about your God. This is reflective of his heart, that he desires to show up in desperate circumstances. Now, right off the bat, what I want to show you, and I want to make sure that you don't miss about the story, is that God is actually intentionally telling Moses to take Israel on a path that looks foolish and that's getting them in a predicament. Let me show you what I mean. Last week, we talked about this. There's a lot of debate about where the Israelites actually crossed the Red Sea. And so me showing you this picture, I'm going to go ahead and put this next picture up on the screen. This is not me saying that this is absolutely the path that they took. It is one of the paths that is believed that they took on how they left Egypt. The point of me showing you this is not to make a statement of exactly the path they took, but the reason I show you this is to show you where God told them to go. So if this were the example of the path that they took, they are leaving Goshen, the land of Goshen in Egypt. And if you can see on this screen, it's kind of hard to see, the Red Sea extends right up next to Goshen, and instead of going around it to Mount Sinai, God leads them to go on the left side of it and get trapped by it. And he tells Moses to lead him in this direction. In other words, God's saying, go in this direction, and I want you intentionally to go behind the Red Sea. And there's a reason for this. Look with me in verse 3. This is what God says. He says, Pharaoh will say about you guys, hey, look, these guys are wandering around in the land in confusion. The wilderness has boxed them in. They don't know where they're going. And I will use that to harden Pharaoh's heart again so that he will pursue them. Then I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And so the Israelites did this. Now, if you haven't been with us over the past couple of weeks, we spent ample time unpacking this idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Go back, listen to those sermons. We don't have time to unpack that again today, but that's what's happening. This is the final moment that God is intentionally strengthening Pharaoh's resolve to stand against God to show one final mighty act. And today, what I want you to see is God is intentionally leading Israel into a bad location. He's intentionally leading them to a place where he has to do another incredible act so he can make something great out of it. Now, hear me, quick clarification. I'm not telling you that what you need to take from this is that every time you find yourself in a difficult situation, it's because God wanted you to be there. That's not what I'm saying. But here's what we do need to take out of this, is that we should not assume that hardship equals God has abandoned me. Like, that's not what hardship means. Because if that were the case, why did God lead them into hardship? You understand what I'm saying? It's so easy for the enemy to try to whisper into our minds that the moment that we face hardship, that must equal that God has left me or that I've done something terribly wrong. And that's just not the case. God is leading them into this moment because God desires to show up in desperate circumstances. Check out verse 5. It says, now when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, what is this we have done? Why have we let Israel go from serving us? Now, I just want to pause here and point out something funny about the story. here's what's happening. Once the Israelites have left, all of a sudden Pharaoh just goes, what have I done? Why did I let these people go? And I just got to imagine that some of the Egyptians were like scratching their heads going, maybe it had something to do with the 10 deadly plagues we just had, like reminding him that the reason you let him go was because God's hand is moving. Nevertheless, Pharaoh's heart is hardened and he pursues the Israelites into the wilderness. Look at verse 6. It says he got his chariot ready, took his troops with him, and he took 600 of the best chariots and all the rest of the chariots of Egypt with officers in each. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out defiantly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and his army, chased after them and caught up with them as they camped by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal Zephon. Guys, I practiced that all week and I still can't get it. So here we go. Pause right here with me. Here's the scene, the opening scene of Exodus chapter 14. God intentionally leading Israel into a seemingly bad predicament so that Pharaoh would give chase. And Pharaoh does give chase. And the reason for all of it is because God desires to show up in desperate circumstances. And so very quickly, before we move on from this, can I just lead us all into a moment of personal reflection? Ask yourself this question. Do I trust God even when things don't make sense to me? Like when I come into circumstances that the logic doesn't line up, what is my natural response? When things get difficult, when I don't see how the dots connect, what is my natural response to God? I think many of us, if we're just being honest, feel like God is obligated to explain his whole plan out to us before we get on board with it and he goes forward with it. And that sounds harsh, but that's kind of how some of our hearts are bent. Like, I need you to explain it all to me, God, before I trust you. And maybe your reminder today is to say, that's not faith. That's not trusting God. God wants you to learn to trust him. He wants you to get to the point where you could echo the words of Job. You guys know Job's story, the one who God called righteous, and he stripped away all of the things in his life. And in this turmoil, Job, he was wrestling with it. He was questioning God, but he was never questioning God's goodness. And in this moment where all was taken from him, Job said the words, though he slay me, I will still trust him. Like, is that your reaction? That if God was literally leading you to a point that was mirroring being slain, you trust that he's working something out. Others of us, maybe we don't have this obligation that God needs to tell me how all things are working out. Other of us, maybe we just begin to doubt that God's even there. We begin to say that God has abandoned us. And again, just to echo what we said earlier, we cannot confuse hardship for God abandoning us. God's ways are different than ours. He's got a plan. Remember the words of God through the prophet Isaiah. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not like my ways, declares the Lord. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts above your thoughts. Guys, we don't think like him, but we got to trust him in the times where we don't quite yet understand how all things are working out. Maybe this is your first step today. This is what God was leading the Israelites into in this moment. So we're answering this question. What does it look like to trust God to deliver? And first, we've seen this reality that God desires to show up. Like, it's a part of his heart. He loves to provide and deliver in the most desperate of circumstances. You need to trust that about your God. But there's more. So read on with me. Look at verse 10. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming after them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. And this brings us into our next idea to think about together, and it's this. We need to firmly understand and believe that the Lord will fight for you. The Lord will fight for you. So picture the scene with me. You're an Israelite. You've just made it to the sea that God, through Moses, has led you to. You're encamped there, and suddenly off in the distance, you see this like just on the horizon, you see this massive army begin to approach. And you know it's the Egyptians. You hear the horses, you hear the stamping, you hear the neighing, and they're hot on your trail. And fear, what we're going to see, begins to well up inside of the Israelites. And look carefully at how they respond here. Look at verse 11. It says, the Israelites said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die out here in the wilderness? What have you done by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt, just to leave us alone so that we could serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Now, before we go on unpacking this idea, let me just ask, do we have any proud conspiracy theorists in the room? Okay, a couple of you are, proud to raise your hand. That's great. I love it. Okay, so let me just point this out. Likely the first conspiracy theory recorded here. I want you to think about what the Israelites are saying here. Here in this moment, the Israelites see the Pharaoh's army is closing in, and they begin to consider, even after all that God did for them, that perhaps Moses was actually in league with Pharaoh. And that Moses, prompted by Pharaoh, had led the Israelites willingly out into the wilderness so that they could kill them there and not have to bury them back in Egypt. This is what they begin to consider. Now, we chuckle at this, but isn't this just a perfect example of what fear does to us? Where when we begin to fear that God isn't at work, isn't with us, it creates irrational reactions within all of us, and none of us are exempt from this. It clouds our judgment. It creates doubt. It causes us to, like the Israelites here, to romanticize our past, to look back and say, oh, remember that? Why isn't that how this is anymore? Look for greener pastures besides what God has called you to in the present. This is what fear does to us. And so look very carefully at Moses' response here in verse 13. We're going to hover on verse 13 for a little while. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. Verse 14, Yahweh, the Lord, will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Man, what a powerful word to receive in this moment. To be told that the great I am, he who has always been and will always be, the true and living God, is going to fight and defend you. He's going to fight on your behalf. The battle is the Lord's. Now, that's an incredible word to receive, but let's also be honest with each other just for a minute. How many of us hear a phrase like that and say, yes, amen, we nod our heads, but then we're inclined to think in our hearts, yeah, but how do I actually do that? What does it look like to let God fight for me? How do I practically take part in this faithful action of letting the Lord fight for me? And what I love about this passage is that Moses gives very clear practical steps and as to how we let the Lord fight for us. So we've already read it, but look back with me in verse 13. What is the first verb that is given that Moses commands of the Israelites? What does he say? Fear not. Fear not, or for us today, to put it in our own words here, choose faith over fear. Like fear, we got that slide, guys. Can we throw that up there, please? Choose faith over fear. This first verb given is fear not. To remember who God is and to not give way to fear. Now, for many of us, we would say, man, that sounds a lot easier said than done. How do I practically choose faith over fear? And for some of us, we might need to be reminded what fear actually is, because fear and faith are not very different. Fear is having faith, but in the wrong thing. Fear is having faith that the worst is coming, even though it hasn't happened yet, and forgetting that God is with you. You're having faith in something that hasn't happened yet. Fear is having faith in what might go wrong instead of trusting in the goodness of God. That's what fear is. And you can choose what you want to believe. You can actively sit down and choose, what am I going to believe? Because when you have fear, it is not based on something that has happened. It's based on something that you think is going to happen. What will you choose to believe? That the worst is to come, or that God is going to be with you? Choose faith over fear. Fear not. That's why Paul says this to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1. He says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and sound judgment. Fear is not sound judgment. And so if you ever find yourself feeling fear, feeling anxiety, feeling despair, you need to call that out and say, I know for a fact that this is not from the Lord. The Lord has not given you that. That is not of the Lord. So we let the Lord fight for us first by choosing to have faith over fear. But there's more. What does he say next? What's the next verse that shows up there? Stand firm. And this idea of stand firm kind of carries with it two ideas. First of all, it's carrying this idea of be still, but also be ready. Stand firm. Stand still. Some translations will say stand still here. This phrase communicates, firstly, the idea that, hey, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't move. Don't go rogue on God. Don't take things into your own hands as things start to get difficult. How often, and I know many of us are prone to this, do when we get fearful or impatient, how often is our response to try to fix it ourselves? Stand still. Stand firm. This is what that God speaks again to the prophet Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 31, well-known verse. They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength, shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint. So stand still is the idea of stand firm, but also secondly, it communicates the idea of, hey, be ready. He doesn't say lay down. He says stand firm, be ready. It means to trust that God is working something that only he can do, but at some point we will need to move. I'm staying ready. And your job is to move when God tells you to. And so Moses has instructed the Israelites, don't fear, stand firm, but there's one more verb here in verse 13 that he calls them to. What's the next verb you see there? What is it? Everybody say it? See, right? And most of our translations, the verb that you see there is see, but in the Hebrew, this is an imperative. It's a command. And so in normal English, what's the words that we typically use when we command somebody to see something? Look or watch, right? Like if you're about to stand up and do something, you say, watch this. Look at me. This is this next command that he gives in verse 13. Watch. Look expectantly for God to move. Don't fear. Stand firm and watch. Look for what God is doing. And for many of us, maybe this is your weakness today where you need to grow. We love God. We say we trust him. We obey him as best we can. Maybe you don't have any major sins in your life. You love him. You trust him. But ultimately, we don't actually expect him to move in powerful ways. Like we just don't really. We're fine with it. We just say, I'll get through it. It's fine. But we don't actually think that God's working a powerful work in our lives or in our situations. And so we don't look for it. And we hang our heads in pessimism, not wanting God to let us down. Anybody ever, does that speak to anybody in here? Like you don't look for what God's doing because you're afraid that he's going to let you down. That's one that's been haunting me over the past 2 years. We miss the things God's doing because of this. Here's Isaiah again, chapter 43, verse 19. He says, look, I'm doing something new. Even now it is coming. Do you not see it? Indeed, I'm going to make a way in the wilderness, rivers in the desert. I think it's important here with this command to look, to watch. It's important to point out a specific clarification. This doesn't mean we sit there trying to guess what God's going to do. There's a difference between watching and then trying to guess what he's going to do. Because think about it. Here in this situation, again, spoiler alert, God's going to part the Red Sea. How many of the Israelites, do you think thought that was going to happen? Very, very, very few. And the reality is if you sit and are trying to guess what God is doing, you're going to be left disappointed because more than likely what you think or want God to do is not what he's going to do. So there is a difference between looking and being expectant for God to move and then actually guessing and trying to play the guesswork of what he's doing. There is a difference. Looking for God doesn't mean guessing his next move. It means believing that he will move. Does that make sense? Like, looking for God is not predicting his methods, but just trusting that he is at work. And that is what God calls us to do. That's what Moses says to do. Look, God's about to work a mighty work of salvation. Look for it. Expect it. Have a heart that expects that God is going to do something, that trusts in him. And so there you have it. In verse 13, there's these three ideas of how we let the Lord fight for us. But there's one more command that happens in this little moment that I want to point out. And I love this one. I love this one. It steps on so many toes, including my own. So after Moses gives these three instructions in verse 13, look what God says to him in verse 15. I love this. The Lord said to Moses, why are you still crying to me? Tell the people of Israel to get up and go forward. I love this. God calls out Moses and the Israelites and tells them, hey, stop your praying. Move. Now, this isn't saying, like, don't pray, but it's saying enough sitting and praying and go pray while moving forward. Put action to what you're praying for. And here's this last one. So if we're talking about what this looks like to let the Lord fight for me, go forward. Follow the movement of God. When God reveals himself to you in his word or impresses it upon your heart according to his word, don't sit in it, church. Here's just a friendly reminder. There is a time to sit and pray, and there is a time to pray and act. And rather than just stand around reluctantly or pessimistically or fearfully, when God has revealed something to you and you know it, you see it clearly, move, respond, be obedient to what God calls you to do. James speaks of this in his letter. He says this, sin is to know what is good, what you should do, and then to not do it. And for many of us, we sit and we pray for God to give us a word to lead us and guide us in a certain direction. And when he reveals it to you, when he points out the sin that's in your life, when he shows you the person that he wants you to love on, we then sit on it. And we pretend we didn't receive that instruction. And maybe, here's just a maybe, I'm not forcing this on anybody, but maybe you're sitting in a time of drought right now feeling like God's not speaking to you, and it's because you haven't done what he's already told you to do. And I find that so often in my own life that God's not abandoned me. He's just waiting for me to like obey what he's already told me a million times. And I've just put it on the back burner. Go forward. This is how we let the Lord fight. We trust him when he tells us what to do. And then we do it. And this is what happens with Moses and the Israelites here in this story. Look with me in verse 16. God says this, as for you, Moses, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, divide it so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. As for me, I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will continue to come after you, and I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who was going in front of the Israelite forces, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. And it came between the Egyptians and the Israelites. And there was cloud and darkness, and it lit up the night, and neither group could come near one another all night long. So here it is. Here's this moment. God is about to make his final move in and through Moses. God fighting on behalf of the Israelites. And while the Israelites break camp and get ready, thousands upon thousands, a million multitude strong, getting ready to move, God begins to fight on behalf of the Israelites. And the great pillar of smoke, the great pillar of fire moves from in front of them to in between them and the Egyptians, holding off the Egyptians as the Israelites get ready. And this is what we see, church. That we're called to let the Lord fight for us. And the way that we do this is to fear not, stand firm, watch, and go forward. And you might say, like in response to this, Pastor, that sounds so simple. Like, surely I would have done that by now, right? But the reality is if we're honest, most of us struggle with at least one or two of these. And it keeps us from experiencing the hope that comes with knowing that God's fighting for you. Some of us struggle with fear, and we'll just stay paralyzed. Some of us struggle with standing firm. Either we get antsy and we try to take things into our own hands, or we're not standing firm, we're laying firm. And when God does something, we're not ready. For others, we're not watching. Some of you trust God but sit in a place of just pessimism. God's not going to act. Like he's good. I believe I'm going to heaven. But for me and my circumstance, you're not actively looking for what God is doing. And then for some of you, you get cold feet. And when he does reveal himself, what you're supposed to do, you don't move. And I just leave that to you. Which one is your step that you need to grow in today? So we're asking and answering this question, what does it look like to trust God to deliver? And we've seen it starts with understanding that God desires to work in desperate circumstances. Like if you don't believe that, then you're not going to be looking for him. If you don't believe that God delights in being in your hard circumstances and delivering you through them, you're not going to trust him. You got to believe that. You also need to believe that he is and will fight for you in these circumstances in ways that you can't. And maybe you can't even understand, but he does and he will fight for you. There's one more thing that we need to see together, and it's this. Look at verse 21. It says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. And so the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and on their left. And very quickly, this leads us to our last point to see together, and it's this, that God can make a way through the impossible. So here we go. Here's this famous moment. The Red Sea parted. The moment Moses lifts his hands and his rod, and the waters part so that the Israelites may pass through on dry ground. And this moment has grabbed the attention of theologians and historians and scholars and archaeologists for a long time. And there's lots of discussion about if it happened, where did it happen? And there's also lots of discussion about how did this happen? Like, how did this come about? And some people will argue, well, it happened by natural means. And others say, no, it's by supernatural means. And there's so much fun discussion to be had about this. Regardless of how it happened and where it happened, what I want us to zero in on here to end is the point that it happened. You know what I'm saying? And rather than spend time discussing some of those things, which are great things to discuss, please, I'm a nerd. I love those kind of things. We don't have time to tackle them today. But what I want us to really focus on is asking the question, why did it happen? What does it mean that it happened? What is the just core message that God is sending to the Israelites and to the world by letting this incredible act that is without him completely impossible? What does it mean that this happened? Maybe you should ask this question. Like, why the Red Sea? Why bring salvation by passing through a body of water? You ever thought about that? Listen to this quote from one commentator. He puts it this way, and maybe you'll recognize this as soon as we read it. See, in the biblical story, water, especially large quantities of it, is often a symbol of death and chaos. For the Israelites, passing through the Red Sea would have signified a literal passing through death itself into freedom. Think about this. Go a little further with this comment. I think it's very true. What's the first story that you could think of that's a large amount of water that it results in death? Noah and the flood. A pinnacle story. But it's not just that. Jonah being cast into the heart of the sea. That was death. Unless God rescued him from it, which he did. In the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation, some of you guys know the answer to this question. We're introduced to these very scary, symbolic beasts that show up. Where do they emerge from? The sea. And think all throughout the book of Psalms, what metaphor time and time and time again represents danger and death? It's water, billows, waves crashing over my head. This is a symbol. This is a biblical symbol of death, destruction, and chaos. And yet God chooses for Israel's path to go straight through the heart of the Red Sea, of this large body of death. And in other words, here in the most desperate of circumstances, God chooses to deliver Israel through the very thing that represents death itself, the cold, dark waters where you sink and drown and die God makes a way through the most improbable and impossible of circumstances. And he can do the same in yours. Just like he does for the Israelites here. Look what happens next, verse 26. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back on the Egyptians and on their chariots and horsemen. And so Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal depth. And while the Egyptians were trying to escape from it, the Lord threw them into the sea, and the water came back and covered the chariots and horsemen, plus the entire army of Pharaoh that had gone after them into the sea, and not even one of them survived. Check this. Don't miss this. Not only did the deadly waters of the Red Sea become the path of salvation for God's people, it was also the place where the enemy was defeated. Now let's connect the dots. Where else in my Bible do I hear the message that the cold, dark reality of death becomes the place of defeat for my enemy, while also being the place where I find life? And we look no further than the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The one who came, lived the life that we could not live, showing us perfectly how to love God and love people. And he led a new exodus. And it led to a cross. Here's the rest of that commentary. It says this. It says, passing through the water becomes a biblical pattern that Jesus fulfills in his death and resurrection. And guess what? We continue on that pattern, because when we choose to follow Jesus, what do? We pass into the water and we come out again. Jesus, the true and better Moses, is leading another Exodus story. And we talked about this 2 weeks ago with the Passover. But here and now, it's worth pointing it out again that just like Moses, the rescue plan of Jesus leads to a very, very unlikely place. It leads to the cold, dark waters of the cross, where he would be willingly give himself over to death, to the waters of death. But praise be to God that through that death, you and I can be saved.